The modern waterfront along the Connecticut River at Hartford gives little sense of the lively dock area that thrived here in centuries past, back when the city was a significant trading port and transportation hub. Hi, this is History with me, Dan Sterner. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel as we delve into some of what was lost along the river over a century ago. Even before the construction of the interstate highways and the city's massive mid-century urban renewal projects, much of the old riverfront had already been long cleared of old maritime-era landmarks. That's because when the Bulkeley Bridge was erected in the first decade of the 20th century, the city of Hartford demolished many structures south of it to build a grand new boulevard that linked the bridge to the foot of State Street. And 30 years before that, other structures had also been lost when the Valley Railroad came through this area. In this video, I'm going to quote from several articles that appeared in the Hartford Courant newspaper between 1905 and 1908. These pieces give some of the history of what was being lost at the time and what the area was like in the old days. So let's get started. Quote, 60 years ago, the land now taken up by the boulevard was occupied by the best stores and residences of the city. 30 years ago, the residences had become tenements, and the stores were of the sort found in the tenement districts, or they had been turned into warehouses. Many of the old buildings that were raised by the Bridge Commission had no history of which to be proud. They were coal sheds or freight depots from the beginning, and never in their careers rose to more noble use. But others were once pointed out as ornaments to the city at a time when most of the city was east of Main Street and north of Sheldon Street. One of the most famous of all the old buildings to give way to the approach of the new bridge was a stone warehouse at the corner of Commerce and Ferry Streets. Though it looked as if it were built at the time of the pyramids, it was in reality constructed in about 1840 by Asa Farwell, who had then made a comfortable fortune. Beginning as a poor boy, he learned the confectioner's trade and prospered in it until he was able to carry on a trade with the West Indies and to deal in liquor, then as respectable a commodity as sugar. There still live a few old men who once went down to Asa Farwell's warehouse to drink cherry bounce for their stomach's sake. The liquid consisted of St. Croix or Jamaica rum, in which wild cherries had been put a few months before. There also still live men who as boys earned a few silver coins by picking wild cherries by the bushel for such merchants as Asa Farwell, and it takes a good many wild cherries to fill a bushel. The business prospered, and Farwell in his time was able to build what was the finest house in Hartford, and which stood at the corner of Main and Grove Streets on a part of the site now occupied by the Travelers Building. Tradition says that the house cost $75,000 and that Asa Farwell had the entire sum in cash before he commenced to build. He kept this fortune in a wooden chest in the warehouse. The money was in all sorts of forms, silver and gold of American, French, English, and Spanish coinage, with notes of Hartford banks, and when the chest was emptied, the house was finished. A few old residents still remember Mr. Farwell and the velvet roundabout that he wore while among his casks and hogsheads in the old stone warehouse. In his day, Commerce and Ferry Streets contained as respectable residences as Main Street itself, but for some years his storehouse has sheltered rags and junk instead of the rare liquors of Asa's day. The history of the old Valley Branch Station, which stood on the south side of State Street and has been replaced by a neat structure north of State Street because of the boulevard improvements, is of much interest to Hartford and her people. The building was erected by Edwin Taylor in 1835. It was 3 stories high with a slate roof, the first story of stone, and above that of brick. Mr. Taylor kept a grocery store there and it was a great place for people to drop in on their way to and from the steamers which plied between this city and New York. There was then no other means of travel from Hartford to New York than stage and the steamers, and naturally most people preferred the steamers. The line of steamers was owned by the Vanderbilts, and one of the boats, the Water Witch, had for its captain Jacob Vanderbilt, the brother of the old Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. It was not an uncommon thing for the Commodore and his brother to drop into Mr. Taylor's grocery and sample some of the choice St. Croix rum with a little West Indian molasses stirred in, which Mr. Taylor always had on hand. The advent and the departure of the New York boats was then something of an event. Almost all Hartford gathered there, its fair women and brave men, to see the boat depart or to greet guests arriving, for the fashionable part of Hartford was Front Street, where the best families lived. Hacks, carriage, and wagons were so thick on the arrival of the boat in the morning that it was difficult wending one's way to the steamer, and it was the same in the late afternoon, when the people of this city, going to New York on business or pleasure bent, were escorted off by their relatives and friends. As soon as the upboat was seen rounding the bend below Dutch Point, up would go the flag on the storehouse, and for a long time a little cannon would boom out its welcome greeting. There were, in those days, almost as much excitement over the arrival and departure of the New York boat as there now is over the departure of an ocean liner for a foreign port. Charles Dickens, the eminent English novelist, landed at the foot of State Street on his first visit to Hartford in 1842, and Samuel Taylor remembers his coming here from Springfield in one of the old stern wheelers, or wheelbarrow boats, which navigated the Connecticut River at that time. He made another visit to Hartford in 1869 when he came here by rail. At that time, State Street was much lower than now, perhaps 4 or 5 feet at the east end, as evidenced by the doorway to the old building, which was set quite low in the street. And one result was that a light freshet would fill the street with water up to Commerce Street. In the spring of 1837, there was a light freshet and a high wind, and the roof of Mr. Taylor's building was blown off and went sailing into the Connecticut River. Mr. Taylor was somewhat discouraged and decided to give up the grocery business, and later on engaged in the lumber business on Dutch Point. Mr. Taylor sold the building, and a few years later it was sold again to John Smart, a machinist, who was in business there and lived with his family over the machine shop for many years. After his death, the building was sold to the railroad along about 1870 or 1871 and was used continuously as a railroad station until the new station north of the street was occupied. Almost directly opposite the old building stood, early in the last century, the big West Indian warehouse of Eliphalet and Roderick Terry, and the dock east of there was generally well covered with puncheons of rum and hogsheads of molasses, and a frequent sight was that of customers sampling the contents. A little glass receptacle would be let down into a puncheon of rum, a sample taken out. The prospective customer would take a mouthful, test its flavor by swishing it around in his mouth with his tongue, and would then spit out the spirit on the ground. After sampling a few puncheons, he would determine which he preferred at the price. The bung would be driven in again, a few chalk marks would indicate the purchaser, and the transaction would be closed. Long credit was given, and it might be 3 months before the customer paid for the puncheon of rum or hogshead of molasses, or oftener he gave a note which had a longer time to run. Molasses was brought in a similar manner, a stick being pushed in the bunghole, withdrawn, and the nature or quality of the contents being tested with the tongue. The same stick was used by everybody, microbes being unknown in those good old days. The Ferry Street Slip neighborhood was a busy mart many years ago. The big warehouses down there were built in 1808. The ferry was run before the original bridge was built. Much business was transacted down there in the olden times, and it was a gathering place for farmers who had produce to sell and who came to town to make purchases. It was also the headquarters of rivermen and fishermen, and there was a Fulton Street market on a small scale there. The locality was the headquarters of fish dealers. Nearly all the shad caught in the river was brought there, and boats filled with oysters and clams could always be found tied up to the docks. East of the fish markets was the steamboat office of M.W. Chapin, father of A.D. Chapin. Mr. Chapin said yesterday that his father conducted a line of propellers that ran between this city and Philadelphia. They carried freight, and the line was started before there were any railroads. He believed the line was withdrawn about 1878. During the Civil War, these boats were taken by the government and used to transport stores for the Army and Navy. At that time, Mr. Chapin replaced them with sloops, and after the war, he got his propellers back again. One of the warehouses was occupied by Zephaniah Preston as a feed store and grist mill. There was a trough there for horses so the farmers could feed them while doing their trading. He said he remembered the ship chandlery, and it was south of the slip. The fish markets were mostly controlled by Sam and Bill Church. These markets were torn down when the Valley Railroad was built. One of the most notorious of the old buildings to be torn down to make way for the boulevard was the River House, which stood on the site of a grocery store, which was in turn replaced by a tenement house. George Robinson built the foundation of the tenement house, and after James Wilson had completed the building, it was used for a number of years as a hotel. The Bridge Commission bought the property of E. Newton Atherton. Mr. Atherton and his wife, who as Tilly Ashley has considerable reputation as an oarswoman, will probably move to California. Starting above the old bridge, the wharves as usually recalled were first a lumber wharf called White's Dock that was near the present power station. Just below the bridge was the steamboat wharf, and just south of that the dock of the Union Line. The old ferry to East Hartford from the foot of Ferry Street came next, and then the Chapin and Burr Wharf. Daniel Buck and Company ran a steamboat line to New York from the foot of State Street, the ships sailing twice a week. Below was Flowers Dock, and Woodruff and Beach, manufacturers of marine machinery, had the next frontage, and it was here that a number of vessels were fitted up in the Civil War. It is reported that the frigate Hartford got her machinery here, and it is known that at one time as many as 4 converted war vessels were waiting in the river to receive their equipment. A private stone dock was just below this, and then came the gas company at the foot of Potter Street. The last dock was that of the Connecticut sawmill at Dutch Point. Unquote. I hope you enjoyed hearing these stories about the old riverfront of Hartford, Connecticut. Remember to subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.